Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Coaster, and join me as I try to embark on a new journey to build another roller coaster after I've already been running too many projects at the same time. But this one, I actually started for a pretty interesting reason. It's very similar to grapefruits, and it's actually during the time that I was working on grapefruit that I felt like also trying to make a realistic wooden coaster that I figured this would be a very interesting project to try and take a shot at. So what is this? Basically in this series I'll be trying to make a GCI wooden coaster, and for those of you who do not know what I'm talking about or do not know how the hell I'm gonna try to achieve that, I'll try to explain more of that throughout this video. But basically in essence I'm trying to build a wooden coaster in an as realistic as possible way, in a way that I've never actually seen before in Planet Coaster. So for those of you who aren't familiar with GCI and what it is exactly, GCI, or what the name actually stands for, which is Great Coasters International, is a company that manufactures wooden roller coasters. The truth is a little bit more complicated, but you can generally see it as GCI is a company where wooden coasters come from, or at least some wooden coasters. And as a result, many of their coasters are just referred to as GCI coasters. A few good examples, I think, are Gold Striker at, where's that thing again? California something. California's Great America, I think it is. I hope I'm not upsetting anybody, I should have done my research a little bit better. But yeah, that's the park. And also for those Europeans out there, Wodan at Europa Park, for example. Or Troy at Toverland. Or if you're from China, then Wood Coaster, which is the lamest name ever for a coaster, but probably one of the best layouts ever, and ironically, possibly one of the best wooden coasters on the planet. So they've actually gotten quite a few wooden coasters with a very good reputation out there. But the thing that I think is very special about the company is that you can really tell that they have a different way of creating their coasters, and definitely toward the uninitiated, which was me for the longest time, you can't really see much of a difference between wooden coasters from one manufacturer and wooden coasters from another manufacturer. They're all out of wood, they all look more or less the same. The track looks very similar, the catwalks look very similar, but the thing that makes Great Coasters International coasters really stand out is their track work, the way that the layout is made, the sort of transitions it has, the way that it rides most of all. They're very unique coasters, and they're extremely hard to make. I always thought that their coasters were very similar to another manufacturer called Gravity Group, who's made coasters like the Voyage or Ravine Flyer 2. But actually there is a world of difference between these two manufacturers and other manufacturers of wooden coasters out there as well. And where Gravity Group wooden coasters are quite easy actually to make and design, since their layouts are very straightforward in track shaping, and you basically just have to make sure that they're pretty smooth. For Great Coasters International coasters, it's so much more difficult than that, and they have a very signature style of designing their coasters. And to be honest, I have never ever seen a realistic GCI in Planet Coaster. It's of course possible that people have been doing this, but so far I've never actually seen one that really made me feel like it was a GCI coaster. And the same almost goes for No Limits even. I know there are many people who have tried it, and I know that there are actually a lot of creations out there who do a really good job at trying to emulate the GCI style. But it's always really difficult to get to it exactly. And as a disclaimer, I should also say at the start of this video that I don't think I'm gonna be successful at it much at all in this video either. It's just so damn difficult to get that sort of track shaping precisely the way that GCI does it. But at least I wanted to give it my best shot in Planet Coaster to try and see how far we can actually push this coaster creator, and see how realistic we can actually make certain types of coasters. So I think it's about due time that I actually talk about why GCI coasters are so unique. So there are quite a few things to factor in, but one of them, and this is something that you might start noticing if you watch a lot of POVs of GCI coasters, especially ones like Troy or El Toro at Plön Park in Germany. They have super snappy transitions. There are always these little moments when going from one curve to another, or even in the middle of a curve, where the track just sort of moves in such a way that there's a little pop of airtime on it. So there will be some curves that maybe go horizontal, and then after just a little bit they just suddenly dip vertical before returning to be a regular curve again. And in the middle of that curve, because of that sort of little dip where you suddenly start going down, you come out of your seat for like a fraction of a second, and then you go again on the curve. And it's all of those moments that sort of bring you out of your seat, that make sure that you don't really sit in there just comfortably. Well, they're always comfortable, but you never really stay in place on them. There is always these little moments where you fly out a little bit, and there's even some moments where you're sort of thrown into the side for a little bit. There are always these little moments that almost feel like they shouldn't be there, like it's a Roller Coaster Tycoon designed roller coaster where, you know, in Roller Coaster Tycoon there's this moment where you have a curve that's completely flat, but you want to sort of extend it into a curve that goes down. You always have that one track section that has to go from flat to going down gently while keeping the bank, and after that returning on the curve. Those are the types of things that you'll actually find on GCI coasters, and yet they're pretty smooth and quite comfortable. But it's just these little moments that are one of the defining things about GCI coasters. There's a lot more complicated things going on in the background that honestly I don't really understand, because I'm not an engineer in any way, and I haven't really studied for any of this, nor do I have any experience in FED or anything like that. It's much more complicated than what I'm saying, but I think this is probably one of the easiest ways to illustrate it to somebody who's never heard about it before. And this is the sort of wooden coaster look and feel that I want to try to get as close to as possible with Planet Coaster, with this coaster. Now there are a few other things, there are quite a few other things that I had to keep in mind while building this coaster. One of them is that I wanted to make the entire thing out of 4-meter sections, since even though GCI coasters will throw you around and have all of these strange transitions that don't look like they're smooth, they are actually quite smooth, and they're quite a comfortable experience, especially with those beautiful Millennium Flyer trains, which are these new trains that recently came out with one of the latest updates of Planet Coaster, and I was super happy to finally see these trains in the game. And also, there's another reason that I wanted to go for 4-meter sections as well. The reason being that it gives you a lot of control over the banking versus the way that the track is actually going. So one thing about GCIs is that their layout is designed separately from their banking. Now this I have to thank Kyle Sloan for a lot. I've already named him on my grapefruits video, since he was the one who originally taught me about the 4-meter method, and he actually knows a lot about GCI coasters as well. He currently works for Skyline Attractions, which has some relationship creating GCI coasters. I don't know the exact extent toward it, but basically a lot of the former GCI employees left the company and started Skyline Attractions, and now the two companies are working together to create GCI wooden coasters. That much I can probably say without going into slightly off territory where I probably start saying things that are completely incorrect. So basically, he knows a lot about this stuff, and I had a conversation with him a very long time ago in which he helped me to sort of get a bit of an understanding of GCI coasters. I'm pretty sure that I'm still very much a noob compared to anybody who actually knows a lot about it. But there was actually a lot of very useful information spread in there. So one of them was the fact that banking is done separately from the layout. So the layout is drawn, and then the banking is added later on. And so what really helps in Planet Coaster is that you can at least have these two things separately, trying to get these transitions that go from banking in one direction into the other, right? And also, what's quite nice is that we have separate control over the curves left or right, and the vertical position of the track, which just helps to get the transitions a little bit better as well. And it actually helps in trying to create what a GCI feels like because of a few limitations. I wouldn't really call them limitations, but because of the way that they're actually designed. Now, from what I've heard from him, and I haven't really got this from any official source, this is just anecdotal evidence at this point, so If I'm saying anything wrong, please do correct me. But from what I've heard, basically the way that these coasters are designed is they're made out of all these 2D plans. So there's a top plan being made, there's a side view being made, and then last but not least, the banking is applied to that. So you can tell that the way that all of the movements of the track are actually made separately. So not only is the banking made separately afterwards, after designing the layout itself, but also the height is designed separately from the sort of 2D top view of the coaster. And all of this is done with just basic shapes like circles, parabolas and straight lines, and also sine transitions, which with my not limited knowledge I can only say is probably going to be the transitions between different curves, where even though the curves on the GCI look very circle-ish, the transitions between taking a curve to the left or taking a curve to the right will be a bit of a parabola, where it evens out in the middle of it. At least that's what I'm pretty sure is going on there. So the design is actually quite simple in that way, but it's really smooth, and it's typically GCI. Instead of just designing the whole layout in one go in a sort of 3D space and being computer calculated that way. So that's really as far as I can talk about that. I'm probably quite a lot better at just nerdgasming over these things. To be honest, I only have 2 GCIs under my belt. I've got George and the Dragon at the Efteling and Troy at Toverland. And Troy is super amazing. I really love that coaster, but that's not really that much, but I can definitely tell the way that it's going on is very different from other wooden roller coasters, and those transitions are so damn good. There are quite a few moments on Troy, for instance, where you do have that moment where in the middle of a curve you sort of straighten out for a bit, and your direction vertically changes. So either you go up in the curve and suddenly it starts straightening out and then the curve sort of continues, or you do the opposite thing where you're in a straight curve and then there's this little pop where you just go down for a little bit and you come out of your seat for a bit and then you return into the curve. And those are really just the moments that are really cool about these rides. Or the way that when you're going up a hill and it sort of curves on top of that hill, while it's banking and getting into the curve, the track already flattens out a bit, and then during the curve you're sort of on a straight circular curve. So the transition from going from a straight piece of track into a banked curve, that very transition isn't just something where your body rotates a little bit to start banking, but it's one where you sort of fly out of your seat and then you're sort of thrown into the curve. It's so hard to describe it, but they're so awesome. I do know though that they're pretty controversial coasters. There are some people that are absolute GCI fans in the coaster community and some people who don't really love them as much. But from the little bit of a taste that I have so far, I'm definitely quite a fan. The one GCI that I've never actually been on though is Wood Coaster in China, in Night Valley. And this is one I think I dropped in the beginning a little bit. It's really a mental coaster in terms of layout. It's built on the hillside, and that's what inspired me mostly to build this coaster on the hillside as well. And it does a couple of other GCI quirks as well. GCI coasters very often fly through their stations, and that's something that I wasn't able to get into this coaster, but it's still something that you'll see many GCIs doing. There's a moment in the middle of the ride where it sort of just flattens out for a bit and it flies through the station building and then just flies out again. And it's really quite awesome, since when you're standing inside the station waiting for the ride, the car actually just passes by the station, and if you're lucky the whole thing rattles and there's this big roar of wood. It's super loud, but it's really awesome, and it's not just a great way to get you pumped for the ride itself, but it's also a great sense of speed while you're on the ride itself. And for Troy, for instance, I definitely know that after you pass the station for a little bit, you're being thrown down very quickly again, and there's these couple of little moments where you basically just fly everywhere in super rapid transitions, and it's one of my favorite parts of the ride. Also, another very typical GCI thing is to have a curved drop. There's a very typical GCI curved drop, which I can't really get the exact shaping of in Planet Coaster, but doing the drop is the one thing that I probably redid the most out of everything on this coaster, since they have a very, very typical drop. It's a drop where you start going down quite steeply, but with a very gentle curve. Like the top of the lift hill is quite a gentle curve, and then as you go down the drop, you also start getting into a curve, you start banking and you start flattening out the track. And by the time you're at the bottom, you're fully into this circle of a curve, and sometimes there's also this bit of a moment where you start going up again, which I also put on this coaster. So yeah, it's very typical of GCI coasters to have a curve drop. There are some exceptions. George and the Dragon in the Efteling, being a dueling coaster, has a straight drop that is nevertheless still really awesome. Or Wood coaster at Night Valley is one that has a sort of pre-drop section that's a bit interesting, but that's really just because it follows the hillside. But for many of the standard GCI coasters that are just built on flat land and standalone wooden coasters, they have this sort of curved drop. They also have a very gentle lift hill. It's not a very steep lift hill. It's somewhere around 25 degrees, I think. At least that's what I went for with this coaster. I don't know the exact amount of degrees. It's not really something that I was able to Google exactly. But it's a really gentle incline for the lift hills. So that's something that I put in here as well. Another interesting fact about these coasters, apparently, is that they never go underneath a curve. So there are actually very many moments on GCI wooden coasters compared to other coasters where the track goes underneath another part of the track. But never will a GCI coaster go underneath a curve, since that's just supporting issues, apparently. Since curves are a lot more difficult to support, especially GCI wooden coaster curves. You can quite easily tell GCI apart just by the way that the curves are supported. There are these slanted diagonal beams coming out from the directions, which is very hard to describe. I should just put a picture up in here. So yeah, you've got those very interesting supports going on as well. And basically they don't really want to have to deal with putting a piece of track underneath that, so usually GCI coasters go underneath their own track on a straight piece of track. Something which I couldn't exactly follow on this coaster, even though you could probably tell by now I've redone the layout quite a few times. There are still some moments where it sort of just slips underneath part of a curve, but I hope it's not too bad. At least there is no point where it really sort of goes underneath the middle of a curve, and very clearly in a place where you would want to have those supports. A side note though, I don't think I'll quite be supporting this thing with GCI supports. It would be a hell of a lot of work, since you'd basically have to start from scratch, add all of the very typical supports to it, and basically do it beam by beam. And that's not something that I really have the time for, to be honest. I was already quite mad to put many hours into making this layout, between the things that I didn't record and between the redoings of every part of this layout, removing all parts, accidentally not saving this thing, which happened at some point, and trying to redo the first drop every goddamn time. I think I spent somewhere around like 8, 9, 10 hours or something like this on this coaster. It's not exactly something that I'm very proud of, but I enjoyed the entire thing. I don't know what's wrong with me. It was quite a lot of fun to do it. So at this point you're looking at one of the last versions of this coaster. There was a reason that I removed this version though. It was a bit too close to the park map, and you could tell that I was sort of ruining the ending there, just to be clear of the park map. And that's something which I later on figured that's kind of a shame. It might just be better to move the coaster, redo the terraforming, and give myself enough space to actually finish up this layout in a decent manner. So that's something that I ended up doing eventually. But apart from that, from the first drop into the last section of the track, everything is basically going to remain more or less the same. So I'll be doing or redoing the last part of the track over here, but the rest is just going to remain the same way that it was. So I think it's probably a good time to go through the layouts. It's kind of weird because I've never actually done an episode where building the coaster is the only thing that I've been doing in the entire episode, because no layout so far has taken as much time. So if we go through the layout itself, we start off with that first drop, that slick GCI curved beautiful drop that I sort of butchered in game, but it was my best try in the end, and I was more happy with this rendition than all the other ones that I tried. So yeah, we're starting out with that, heading into a small hill in the middle of the curve. It's quite a long winding curve. Into another transition that's sort of like an airtime hill transition. You catch a bit of airtime as you fly over into the other direction and take a curve into the other direction. Then it sort of starts going up the second largest hill of the coaster, evens out as it gets into the banking of the curve, and turns around. And there's a bit of little airtime moments and bits and bobs where it does some shaky transitions. And at some point, there's a point just before you pass underneath the lift hill where it sort of touches the ground and never leaves the ground again. And at that point, it's basically just a terrain conforming coaster. One of the reasons that I did that is because there's still too much friction on the coasters in Blended Coaster, and that mostly goes for the wooden coaster. So this wooden coaster unfortunately does have quite a bit more friction than it would have in real life, so I saw doing a terrain coaster out of this as pretty much my only way to make this actually realistic in terms of speed, and have the coaster keep its speed until the very end of the ride. Because that's one thing I should definitely notice about GCIs as well. They just keep going. Like, from the beginning until the very end of the ride, it just feels like you never slow down. They definitely do slow down, of course, there's physics, but the slower you get, the quicker the curves become, the quicker the transitions become, the lower it comes to the ground, and you never really lose that sensation of speed until you hit the very final brake run, and that's something that I really love about these coasters as well. I should actually say though that I made a bit of a mistake a few minutes ago. That was actually not my final rendition of the layouts. I actually ended up messing with the layout quite a few more times over here. So, shit. I took way too much time trying to perfect this layout, is basically what I'm getting to. I also put, admittedly, a little bit too much airtime on some of these hills. You definitely come out a little bit more than you usually would on a GCI coaster, but that's not something that I'm gonna complain about. I'm perfectly fine with that. I think it's an improvement, if anything, so I'm just gonna keep that around. Hopefully it won't be too much of an issue. There's a thread on the No Limits exchange by Kyle in which he explains how to make GCI coasters and mentions that you should keep the negative G's to about minus 0.1 to 0.2, but if it runs a little bit faster than that, it's fine. So I'm gonna say that it's fine that it runs a little bit faster than that. Hopefully it should be okay that I'm hitting a few, well, more negative G's on some of these hills than just that. Although I am trying to really keep it even among the entire layout, so the first couple of hills pull about as much as the final hills, and the terrain also helps to keep the sensation of speed going throughout the layouts. Hence why it's so close to the ground at the end of the ride. But yeah, I haven't really talked about the final section yet. The final section is a little bit different from the first section since there aren't really quite as large dips, valleys and hills, and it's more about the curves, the twisting very close to the ground, and the transitions between those curves, so you can definitely tell that the speed is a little bit less, but the transitions are a little bit quicker and there are more of them, so it should hopefully still have the same sort of sensation of speed going as the beginning of the ride. And there are also some, shouldn't have hit the table right there. There are also some transitions that are a little bit like the transitions at the beginning of the ride. So before this final curve right here, there's that bit of a hill where it hops from one curve to another, and where it hops from one direction into another direction. Has a little bit of airtime on top of that hill. And it's very similar to the first hill of the coaster after the first drop. Also, I actually quite liked the infinity symbol sort of layout that we have going with the curves. Some of those moments where, for example, another manufacturer like Gravity Group would have just made the entire thing one smooth curve, but with a GCI coaster you have that little bit where it straightens out for a bit and flattens out for a bit as well, and you have that tiny pop of airtime instead of just the entire curve being one smooth curve. And it's just one of those typical moments that I at least try to sprinkle in there as much as possible to still sell the idea of this being a GCI coaster, even if the track shaping isn't really realistically GCI. Now over here, at last, I'm actually done with the layout. I forgot to save at this point, so I had to redo this part, but it's pretty much exactly the same as I'm laying it out here. One last interesting quirk, the brake run is banked very slightly, because of the way that the magnetic brake fins have to fit into the magnetic brakes at the brake run. So because there's a bank that's banked the other direction than the final curve, the brake fin should fit in the brake slot a little bit better. Not entirely sure about the terminology there, but it's something that many GCI coasters do, so it's one little touch that I wanted to add to this coaster as well. And with a little bit of final smoothing, this coaster's layout is done. And with that said, I would like to end this video with a POV and a big thank you for watching, especially if you've been able to get your way through all of this coaster ranting, which has been way more than I was hoping for and way more than I've ever done probably. But if you're interested, I could totally recommend just going to YouTube and just search for GCI POV and watch all of those things, because they are so beautiful. And just look out for those snappy transitions, those weird little moments in those coasters, those little pops of airtime. Especially if you have a mounted camera POV, you can really notice those moments and notice that even despite all of that, the coasters are really smooth. In any case, that's been it for this episode. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.